Hello and welcome to Tattva Conversations and Explorations. For our third episode on physics, we sat down with Dr. Marco Masi. Dr. Masi obtained a Ph.D. in physics in Italy and has held teaching positions in Italy, France, and Germany. He is the author of a 2-volume series on quantum physics titled Quantum Physics: An Overview of a Weird World. His philosophical interest led him to Sri Aurobindo's work and how it synthesizes science and spirituality. His latest book, Spirit Calls Nature, summarizes his understanding. In this interview, Dr. Masi shares his thoughts on science and spirituality, the scientific relevance of the writings of Sri Aurobindo, and the importance of philosophical thought in the domain of physics. He also talks a little about what consciousness means to him and also about the limitations of the mind. We hope this conversation can help the listener see the Tattva, or true essence of physics, and the important role it plays in helping us to understand the world we live in and appreciate the fundamental forces that lie underneath everything. Thank you, Dr. Masi, for taking this time out to be with us. And
thank you for having me.
We're going to talk about quantum physics and quantum physics and its application in society, for both individual growth and functioning of society. First question to you is, what is the fundamental difference between physics as we knew it all along and the new discoveries in quantum physics that has come out as quantum physics? What is the fundamental difference, and what is the fundamental difference in the philosophies that drives these two different streams?
Yeah. You see that physics, this history of physics found several paradigm shifts. It changed the view of the world from time to time. It started with Galileo and Newton, where you had this idea, Isaac Newton, I suppose, the famous English scientist of the 16th century, also Galileo Galilei, and in Italian physics. Nowadays, we call them physicists or scientists. At those times, there were philosophers of nature, so-called. And it started with a certain worldview where you have a quite mechanistic worldview. And in a certain sense, we still have today. But it was about, I would reduce it to make it simple, to give an intuitive understanding. A universe made of marbles that kick each other. And that's it. And everything can be reduced and explained by just particles hitting around in a completely deterministic way. And this was also embraced by a famous citation that comes to my mind now is of Laplace, who was a French philosopher, mathematician, physicist. At those times, you could be everything. And he said, if there would be a supermind, a sort of cosmic mind, a superintelligence that knows each particle, each position of each particle, and its velocity, its impulse or momentum, it would be able to calculate the trajectory of all these particles from the present to the future, or eventually also back into the past, like a sort of supercomputer that can give this supercomputer each position of the particle, each initial condition, and each velocity, and it will be able to calculate the evolution of the universe, what will happen. This was a very deterministic and mechanistic point of view of the universe. So just gazillions of particles sitting around and kicking each other around, and in principle everything could be predictable. And then I like to cite also there was another revolution that of the Maxwell, I would say, electromagnetic fields, the notion of the field came in. There were not only particles, but also every particle with its field, which means, for example, think of the Earth and gravitational field. We see a clump of matter, and around it, in empty space, a sort of field, a gravitational field, which is somehow attractive for two masses attract each other. And the first to introduce this notion was Faraday, Michael Faraday, which was a famous, also very famous experimentalist, and who made experiments with electricity. And he saw that you can have a clump here, a piece of metal charged electrically, and here somehow a field can be felt if you take another charge, and you can measure the strength of this field. So a second revolution came in, a paradigm shift in the vision of the world, of how the world is constructed, not only particles, but also these particles with them, their fields interacting. Then, of course, at the beginning of the last century, the 20th century, there were the two big revolutions, relativity and quantum mechanics. These again changed our view of the universe, the world, the reality. Relativity told us not only that there are these gravitational fields, but these gravitational fields are somehow a warping of space and time. And he introduced this idea, this weird idea that space and time are one thing that we call nowadays space-time. You must imagine it as a surface that is curved by a mass, and this curvature produces a curvature of space-time around these masses. So we had again yet another shift. We are now again in another sort of world we didn't expect, where not only space-time can be warped, but also time, the speed of the clocks, can be faster or slower according where it is positioned inside a gravitational field or according to the relative velocity of two observers. The so-called, so you have this idea that also clocks can go faster or slower. Again, something very unintuitive, because in the idea of Newton, in the classical physics, there was this idea that time is something absolute and does not depend, is something out there, but or something abstract that is not relative to observers. But probably the biggest paradigm shift came from quantum mechanics. Quantum mechanics, the father of quantum mechanics is considered Max Planck, but probably a historian of science would not necessarily agree with this. But it's just to give you a point. It was more or less at the same time where Einstein wrote his first paper on special relativity. And Max Planck came out, first of all, with the idea that energy is not something continuous, but is absorbed and transmitted in packets of energy, in quanta. Therefrom came the name quantum mechanics. And this was quite a revolution, but because everyone thought that energy is something continuous. No? And then came also the idea, is matter a continuous, stuff that you can cut it in pieces infinitely tiny pieces, or is there a limit and we get an atom? Yeah, the idea of atom, it was not new, it was already in the minds of the ancient Greece, of Democritus, but the real also experimental evidence came much later. Obviously, nowadays we know that there are atoms and so on. And with quantum mechanics, you can describe quite well solid state physics. That means matter, its energy states, the atomic physics. You can also build, unfortunately, nuclear weapons, as you know. And one thing that also quantum mechanics introduced in our worldview and new understanding of the worldview of the universe, so I'm sorry, another new worldview and a new understanding of the universe and of reality, of matter, of everything, I would say, was that it introduced also this sort of weird indeterminism. Huh? You know, probably you have heard about uncertainty principle of Heisenberg, who states substantially that you cannot determine the position and the velocity of a particle at the same time. Yeah? But not because we can't make sufficiently precise measurement, because the particle in itself does simply not have these properties. It is something, a sort of cloud, something undetermined, something that is not there or there. It's a bit everywhere according to a probability. You will not find it there with almost no probability, but you have a certain probability to find it here, yeah, so to speak. And this introduced also the idea that shattered into pieces substantially the worldview of Laplace, who saw all these marbles, as I said previously, and that move according to a deterministic laws. Here in quantum mechanics, this doesn't exist. Everything is somehow unpredictable, which, however, doesn't mean that we don't nothing. We can, however, use statistics and probability density functions, which is sort of the concept of probability, to say that there is a certain probability to find the particle here, or the atom having an energy state, or having whatever. Yeah? So now we have landed into a universe which is completely counterintuitive, which is no longer the reality that we perceive with our senses at our macroscopic bodily level. Physics actually describes a world which is undeterministic, where time can proceed with different speeds, where we have also space-time that is curved, and lots of things that are not so intuitive. And we have some issues with that, because nowadays we also try to regain this old worldview, but I don't think we will never. So yeah, so this was a very brief history of the last 3 centuries of physics in 10 minutes. So very superficial, probably.
Then when you say every time when there is a paradigm shift, when our worldview changes, we see the world differently, and then we start functioning differently. And with this new shift, what has happened, and what do you see happening in the future? One thing that we are increasingly seeing is the man-machine symbiosis. We are more connected to machine, and we are going towards that. Where do you see this? That's my question. Was the philosophies, how they differ? How was it earlier? For me, the philosophy of learning physics or understanding physics was to really get a job that could really be useful to the world, and then even a livelihood. But now it's going beyond that. So if you can talk about that a little.
Yeah, but I think it's didn't change much. Those who are interested and busy with philosophy, as I am, by the way, but I'm not paid by anyone for doing this. So it's if you wish, also my job, my hobby. But I think it has become, may I even say, this is my personal opinion, it has become even worse, that it is too practical oriented nowadays. Physics is almost all about practical application. Our mentality, generally, not only in physics, in science in general, and I would say in our life in general, we always look at only the practical application. Of course, because for example, quantum physics had, of course, a lot of applications. We are talking now through devices which are based on electronic chips, and these chips have been built up in the law laws of quantum physics, solid state physics, and statistical physics, thermodynamics, classical physics, non-classical physics, and so on. If we would not have this knowledge of physics, we could not actually at this moment speak to each other. So the practical applications are without doubts have been enormous and fantastic. That's great. I am not against that, of course. Otherwise, I would not be here to speak with you. So I'm not the guy who would like to go back to the candles and the power of horses. Yeah. But having said that, those people who are interested in the philosophy of science, philosophy of physics, maybe even with weird things connected with consciousness studies and so on, are only a tiny minority. You don't, most of them, the physicists, don't make a living with these kinds of things. Most of physics now is applied physics. It is still in the electronic industry, in building devices for electronics, for computers, and yeah, also of course there is also nuclear power, but I don't know if nuclear power will have future or not, is still a debatable thing. And this is fine, but I don't see personally this sort of transhumanist ideal becoming true. I don't, for example, in artificial intelligence, which is more a field for IT people, not so much for physicists, even though, of course, there are a lot of physicists who work on this as well. But it is artificial intelligence is more a field for computer scientists and perhaps also neuroscientists. But I'm a bit skeptic about this view that we will be able to download our consciousness on a device and upload or download here and there and get a new body or things like that. These are science fiction ideas that are based not on real science. They are based on, yeah, science fiction, which is fine. I like science fiction, but we must distinguish something that is plausible and from something that, or at least has not a real scientific underpinning to say that this will be the future for sure. I don't think so, because I don't think that I'm more not the dualist, but the idealist guy, no? That says that mind consciousness is not an algorithm. And if it is not an algorithm, you cannot down or upload it into a machine or things like that. So this transhumanist vision says, personally, I'm a bit more cautious about that. What we may have is that we will build devices which are good for people with a handicap. Yeah, you know, you maybe you cannot see, and a chip can connect the optical nerve with a nerve that allows you to see, with a nerve in the brain, and that allows you to see, or with prosthetic, how do you call it, limbs, prosthetic limbs, and that you can create some new electronic devices that is connected to the brain. And this already exists now, by the way. But in this way, these things may have a future, yes. But I don't think we will have this new evolution of the humankind from a biological being to a hybrid between biology and machine. I think the transformation will come from within, not from a technology without.
Thank you, Dr. Masi. On that note, could you please introduce us to a little bit about, because you are also studying Sri Aurobindo, and his views about human evolution. So could you please talk about human evolution from the standpoint of Sri Aurobindo's idea of quantum physics?
Oh, okay. So the last piece of the sentence is, I don't think that Sri Aurobindo has said something
about quantum
very
physics.
Quantum physics,
Yes, I understand.
The connection I make.
Yeah.
So I see in many parts of his writings a lot of analogies with quantum physics. But that's my point of view. I must say, you see, I try to be honest in a certain sense that you will find a lot of scientists out there that they make these connections and they see that this is the truth and this is science. I always tell my listeners and say, you see, that's my point of view. I think I have a strong perception that this has something to do with quantum physics, but it's not science as it is. It's not the ultimate truth. Because sometimes people try to sell an opinion as a scientific fact. And this is a trick that I don't like to exercise, to practice. But having said that, yes, I see a lot of connections between quantum physics and Sri Aurobindo. But let me first perhaps talk about the fundamental ideas of Sri Aurobindo as such, because he had this idea as almost mentioned, that there is spiritual evolution in humankind, and not only in humankind, in every life is the expression of an indwelling spirit in matter that grows from inside matter outside. It grows first in an unconscious state from the single cell, a pluricellular organism, plants, animals, humans, and also humans will be surpassed, are transitional beings. Sri Aurobindo used to say humans are only transitional beings in the evolution of the spirit, however, in matter. So he does not contradict modern scientific evolution, Darwinian evolution, or at least he accepts that the scientific evolution, but amends it and says, and this is perhaps at odds with normal Darwinian evolution, that he says there is a goal in evolution. The evolution is goal driven. There is a design, so to speak. It is not just only about random mutations and natural selection. Even though these mechanisms play a role, but it's not only about that. That's the difference between the scientific point of view and the more spiritualistic point of view of Sri Aurobindo. And he said that we are growing from a mental state. We are now mental beings. Mental in the sense we are rational, analytic, we use reason, and we use science. Science is a product of the mind, but also the mind is a form of cognition, which is only a transition from an animal nervous state to something that goes beyond mind. So we are in between. And this reason is only one form of cognition. It is not the ultimate step in the evolution of consciousness, so to speak. I say so to speak because it is a bit contradictory to speak of the evolution of consciousness, because consciousness for me is something that there is out there, and not out there. It is in us, and it does not evolve. What evolves is the structure that is around us. And at any rate, I don't go into these subtleties now. So Sri Aurobindo said there is also something that goes beyond mind. He spoke of a higher mind, so-called. These are just names, but to say something that there is something that goes beyond. Then there is an illumined mind, an intuitive mind, an overmind, and ultimately there is, at the apex, is a supermind, or divine gnosis, he called it also so. And this is what the human beings are going towards. the evolution of humanity is going towards the development of these inner spiritual potentialities and towards an opening to spiritual sources. And this is not at all in contradiction with science. If you read The Life Divine or the Synthesis of Yoga and so on, it has been written 100 years ago, but it is perfectly in line with modern science. It's only a different perspective. It does not only take the purely materialistic perspective, but also a spiritualist perspective, and then makes a sort of synthesis of knowledge. That's what I tried in, not at the level of the supermind of Sri Aurobindo, but that's what I tried to do also. I wrote recently a book which is called Spirit Calls Nature, where I try to make the synthesis between science, neuroscience, biology, physics, cosmology, and also philosophy, the Western philosophy and the Eastern philosophy, and to make a sort of synthesis. Where, however, I did not try to put these things together, not in the sense that you have a whole which is made of several parts, but there is a center principle which expresses itself in different cultures and times, on one side of the world as science, on another side of the world as spirituality, and another place as philosophy, and so on. Yeah, now to make a summary of Sri Aurobindo's view, it's very difficult. It would take probably at least 20 sessions, Zoom sessions, and that probably would not be enough. But intuitively, this is what's about.
You were talking about what Sri Aurobindo wrote 100 years ago. Is very scientific. It is in line with the recent discoveries. If we look at the wisdom of the East, the Vedas, they do talk about these things in a different way. Again, not just the Vedas of the East, even in the Western religions, we take the Bible, you have a lot of reference to how what we see is not what we interact with. We interact with things that are unseen. So there is a hint of, they are hinting at these things that the field kind of is around us, and how we are progressing. And we also see in the ancient world, alchemy was practiced. Now, is this a second step of alchemy? Would you call that a second? Is that, or if we had it already, the wisdom, where did we lose it? And how are we progressing? What are we understanding? Even this is magic to me, even talking to you. This is like local idea, right? And all of this is happening through computer chips and all of that. So if you can talk about that, this is it alchemy? Is it some sort of alchemy? Is that our understanding of this subsurface mechanisms?
I think you are using now your intuitive mind, and that's very fine. That's, we are trying to go a bit just a purely rationalistic point of view. By the way, you also cite non-locality. This is also an interesting aspect of quantum physics I didn't mention, but eventually we can go into this also. That's an interesting question. Was alchemy a sort of unconscious and perhaps a bit naive attempt of humankind to get there where Sri Aurobindo was trying to get? And perhaps also the Vedas. The Vedas were also mentioning about the thousand suns in the matter or the atom or something like that. And it's difficult to say for sure. And by the way, I'm not an historian of chemistry, and I don't know much about alchemy, but as I understand it, alchemists tried to find this sort of energy in matter and to build out of some stuff gold and to transmute matter. There was this idea of the transmutation of matter. And they tried it with just putting things together and see if something sometimes explodes or not. And that led then in a more coherent and more rational understanding of things into chemistry. So in a certain sense, we can say that alchemy, as it was practiced at those times, was, well, everything must be tried out. So they tried out this as well, but it was a very naive and not very effective way of understanding matter, chemistry, what the stuff is made of, that we are made of now. And so in a certain sense, some people brand it as a sort of unreasonable superstition. I would not put it in this way. I would say, yes, it was not the way with which you can transmute matter, but it might have been an intuitive understanding that there is an inherent power in matter that goes beyond the purely physical. That there is, Aurobindo would talk of a mind in matter. That also matter is a sort of a form of mind or consciousness. And if this consciousness emerges, it is able to transmute this matter. I think alchemists had this intuitive feeling and perception of this, yes. And in this sense, yes, we can say that the integral yoga of Sri Aurobindo is a sort of modern alchemy. And I think a much better approach and much more coherent approach, because it does not appeal to any religion, to any fantastic theory. It is based on the experience, on the inner experience, on a mystic, if you wish, experience. But it is based on something that you can prove yourself. It's not just an abstract philosophy. And yes, I would say it is a sort, in this sense, if we use these meanings and the semantics in this sense, could be used, labeled as a sort of new alchemy. But I will never use this word, because when people think at alchemy, they immediately, that's woo science, crackpot science. So I would not use this term. Yeah. Sorry, there was a second part of the question. I don't remember now. I don't know. Did I answer your question? You're muted.
Yeah, you did. You did answer the question. I just wanted to know if is this a resurgence of alchemy, studies in quantum physics?
The study of no. Okay. The study of quantum physics is, I would say, a natural, because I was referring to the yoga of Sri Aurobindo.
Yeah.
This I would call it, in a certain sense, a resurgence of a new form of alchemy. As to quantum physics, no, I would say that quantum physics is first and foremost a development of classical physics. There comes a point in the history of science where suddenly you hit a wall and there are some mysteries appear that you cannot explain with what we know. In the case of quantum physics, the classical physics predicts that every body that has a non-zero temperature, that finite non-zero temperature, room temperature, must explode in a blast of infinite energy. And since we are here, this was a so-called ultraviolet catastrophe. And physicists had to tackle with this, but trying to apply classical physics, it did not lead to any reasonable result. It was necessary a genius like Max Planck who said, wait a moment, maybe energy is emitted and absorbed packet-wise, quantum-wise, and let's make the calculations all over again with this assumption, and let's see if it fits reality. And you see, this was one of the greatest triumphs of mathematical physics, also, or statistical physics, I would say. And so quantum mechanics developed out of a natural logical history of science and physics as it developed in time. Where the philosophy, nowadays we have all these interpretations of quantum physics, because we know we have a science which describes the world, but it's not clear what kind of world it assumes it has. What are we describing here? I make frequently the example of the wave on an ocean. Imagine the wave on an ocean. You can describe a wave on an ocean with a mathematical function. I don't know, sine, cosine wave. Water waves are not sine cosine waves. They have a bit more complex structure, but in any case, they can be described with a mathematical function. Once you know everything about the mathematical function describing a water wave on the ocean, does this tell you something about the nature of this water wave, that it is water, that it is H2O, what the ocean is, what lies below the ocean surface? No, it's still just a mathematical description. And that is very powerful and very practical, because it allows you to make also predictions how the wave will behave given certain initial conditions. But that's the same thing with quantum physics. You have a wonderful mathematical structure and theory which describes in a certain sense the world and allows you to make predictions, and allows you to build these devices that we have, like computers and so on and so on. But we don't understand what is it really describing, the ontology. Yeah. What is the nature of matter? We know that the particle has a probability to be here, 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 or here. But this is something that we don't see in our everyday life. So what is this particle? Is it a particle, or is it something, a sort of cloud, or what? There's no answer. And there comes in this philosophy of science, the philosophers, philosophy of physics, and they have now, physicists and philosophers have developed now a plethora of so-called interpretations of quantum mechanics. People imagine many worlds, a branch at every measurement, or imagine the implicate order of David Bohm, or whatever kind of interpretation. So we have a gigantic, wonderful scientific structure, and we don't know what it is describing really. What is the ontology? This is what are things in themselves. There, in this sense, but I would not call it alchemy. I would not put this in relation with alchemy. No, from this perspective. No. I don't know. Sorry for too long answer, perhaps.
Not at all. Thank you, Dr. Masi. I want to know from you, because you clearly stated that you are not looking at not looking at the future of mankind as something going to do with half machine and half man kind of a life. Then what else is your view? Because the question is, how can the discoveries in quantum physics help in transforming the lives of individuals and societies?
Okay. Yeah. So I think also this philosophy, this philosophical aspect, can help us a lot. It can help us a lot in the sense that science, and more generally mind has one great powerful skill, the first form of cognition in terrestrial evolution, that is able to know its own limitations. Mind is able to understand that it does not understand. mentality, what we call the mind, the reason, which became predominant with the age of enlightenment, in my view, the biggest revolution, the biggest skill of the mind is not so much to produce so much technology and so on, but that it is able to know that it doesn't know, provided that people are honest with themselves. Yeah, because if you lie to yourself, and that's we're in the question of this post-truth era, of the disinformation era, of the propaganda and whatever forms of denial, then you're not honest with yourself. But if one is honest with oneself and is open to change and to also admit one's own errors, you can clearly see the limitations of mind. This has been already seen in mathematics with Kurt Gödel, no? With his theory of incompleteness. But but in order to not to go too far away, so that I don't digress too much, but in quantum physics, we can see the limits of our mind in the sense that, as I said, we have a theory that describes a lot, almost everything, but it doesn't tell us nothing what these things are. And what is lacking is this ontology and model of reality, of the ultimate reality. We don't know what the ultimate reality of things is. And another thing that also quantum physics, I think, is quite adamant about, even though most physicists probably would not agree with that, but that's my opinion. Quantum physics is telling us that the world is a sort of illusion, which doesn't mean that nothing exists. I'm not saying that the world does not exist. I'm not a nihilist. There is something out there. Yeah? But what we think of the world is an illusion. In a certain sense, the film Matrix is not so far-fetched. We live in a sort of matrix. And what we perceive is a sort of virtual reality. Yeah? And that we cast into numbers, into formulas, into scientific theories, but these theories are real, depict a representation of the ultimate reality, no more or no less than a distorted image of something is. But it would say even not that. It is really something completely different. It is like the representation of numbers of bits and bytes inside a memory chip stands to, of an image of reality stands to reality outside. So we really, I think in a certain sense, quantum physics tells us that the world that we have in mind is an illusion. And because otherwise you could not, you have also, so I can take up this idea of quantum non-locality. There is this strange thing that particles seem to be able to connect it one to with another instantly, and not being two particles, but being only a one single whole object, one only object. And yet when you observe it, just tuck, they collapse into two particles. So how should we interpret that? There is, until today, there is no clear answer to this. And every physicist you will find will give you a different interpretations of these things. So it does not help us in a practical sense in building stuff. But the realization of this, if we really become aware of this, that all of the reality that we perceive is a sort of illusion, a representation in our heads. What the reality that we perceive it in here, not out there. If I look at the table, I don't see the table as it is. I see something that a biochemical reaction in my brain that has nothing to do with reality out there. And becoming aware of this, I think also gives you a very different psychological attitude towards life, also emotionally in a certain sense. So in this sense, this philosophizing can be useful to understand what we don't understand, to understand until where we can go so far, and beyond that limit, we can't. And so the question is, what is beyond that limit? And I say, we have to go from a third person perspective, which is typical of science, that looks things from the outside, from a first person perspective, which means we have also to see things from a subjective point of view, especially when we come to the question of consciousness. What is consciousness? What is mind? What is awareness? What all are all these psychological phenomena that we have no clear ideas how to connect these with this still almost Aristotelian, Laplacian view of particles bouncing around. So that's how I see it.
When I change as an individual, how can that change societies?
Okay, I see much more. You see, we have lost a bit this philosophical reasoning in our life. Once upon a time, as I said, they were called not scientists, but natural philosophers. I think we have to regain a bit this ancient wisdom. This doesn't mean that we should go back to Aristotle or believe everything, or to geocentrism and believe that the Earth is the center of the universe. It means, however, that we should have a different attitude towards scientific understanding and be more open to the philosophical and intuitive view of the world. Once you get, and philosophical is the first step, the intuitive is the second step, and the third step would be the spiritual. So most of the scientists that would agree with me in saying we should regain the philosophical tradition and so on might possibly not agree to go also the other steps that I would like to go. But I think it's necessary that we regain the philosophical, intuitive, and spiritual understanding of nature. And this would lead to a new form of science, I believe. And a new form of science would also transform entirely our way of doing science and our way of doing practical things. A frequent example that I make is, which is quite common today, is that of ecology, sustainable energies. How could we build a new society, a new industrial conception of the world, a new economy? So we are talking about very practical things, profiting from this new way of seeing the world, because it's about seeing a new seeing of the world. So you can have a very technical, pretty scientific approach. You say, oh yeah, we must develop renewable energies for solar energy, photovoltaics, batteries, wind energy, and so on, which is all fine. Oh, I'm very in favor of it. I'm not saying that there's nothing wrong, but it is still a very technical point of view. I say go beyond that and take also the intuitive, philosophical, spiritual point of view, and don't see just nature as something that has been exploited and now you must save nature to save yourself. And once you have done this, you can continue to exploit it. Because if we will build also all the renewable energies and ecology and sustainable development ideas and so on, but we don't change our feeling, our inner feeling, our spiritual contact with nature, and we don't see things also a bit from the philosophical point of view, I'm afraid that then these technologies alone will not save us. We also a change of mindset and also change of way of seeing the world must change. And this change of paradigm, of way, this change of way of seeing of the world and of nature, of the universe, cannot come only from the strict analytical scientific exercise that we are doing nowadays. So this could be an example how this can be. And I'm not a psychologist, but I think also psychologists have already discovered this line of research, that we are not just meat robots, brain, and that's it. And all psychology is based only on that. This was an attempt that it has been done, but it was not successful. Psychologists are now realizing that we need also this first person perspective, from the subjective point of view. And I think this will be also useful in physics, because if you take this first person perspective, you understand why quantum physics is so weird. After all, it was inevitable. Once you understand it, you see it's almost self-evident that quantum physics had to lead us at that point, because we are still looking at reality from a purely rationalistic point of view. That one of the aspects of mind is that to reduce everything into pieces, because one of the most powerful properties of mind is that to separate, to understand the world in terms of dualities, to discern, to divide, to cut things into pieces, which is fine. It is very useful. But if you try to generalize this and you think that's the only form of cognizing the world, then you sooner or later will get into contradictions or weird paradoxes. And these are precisely the paradoxes of quantum physics that we have today.
The last question, well, it's not a question. We would like you to talk about your book, the two books, Quantum Physics and the Weird World, a little about it before we conclude.
Yeah, I have it just here behind me. Let me see. So here is one and this one. Hopefully it does not fall down everything. So the quantum physics here, quantum physics, this is 2 volumes.
Yeah.
Quantum physics, an overview of a weird world. And then the second volume. The first volume is more about an introduction and the classical, not classical, it's quantum physics, it's not classical physics, but it is an overview of, it is a primer on the conceptual foundations of quantum physics as such. And it gives you the first basics. The second is more about the 20th century quantum revolution. It is for those who want to stress themselves out a bit more. It's more complicated. Also the first volume is okay. I would say it's not really popular science. It's a bit more. You must know a bit of high school math, high school mathematics. So it's not an easy read, but in my opinion, if you go through it, then you have really the clear picture, at least from the conceptual point of view. You have the clear picture of what modern quantum physics is. And the other that I recently wrote is Spirit Cults Nature. I suggest to take this with this cover, because there are also other versions out there, but they are old versions. And this is the updated version. And this tries to make the synthesis of knowledge. It begins with the limitations of mind that I already discussed here. Then it discusses modern neuroscience, this consciousness studies. What is consciousness? Why? How can a bunch of neurons that interact with each other give rise to a subjective experience of a being? This is one of the great mysteries of the modern philosophy of mind. And I would say one of the greatest mysteries of science, actually. So I go into this and show, I don't show even, it's clear that I believe that it's my position that we will not be able to explain mind and consciousness only in purely a neuroscientific reductionist materialistic way. But I don't show this. I just show that science isn't able to explain it. How to explain it, it comes later. But I show the limitations of modern neuroscience. Then I go also in psychology and also the study of idealism, which is nowadays quite in vogue. There has been a return of idealism, panpsychism, cosmopsychism, because in my view, many scientists and philosophers are beginning to perceive that we got stuck, and they are looking for something that goes beyond the present paradigm. And so they rediscovered ancient wisdom of idealism. But also here I say idealism is a step further, but it's also that is a step in between. In my point of view, the Eastern philosophies, and especially Sri Aurobindo, has given us a real synthesis of knowledge, where you can see all of reality, and science, neuroscience, biology, physics, philosophy, spirituality are the different attempts of the human mind, and something also that goes beyond mind, to get into contact with reality and to understand reality. But how do we do that? Nowadays, there are a lot of people who speak about science and spirituality. It has become a bit of fashion and a sort of new age woo. and yeah, I hope that I have been able to distinguish myself, at least from these currents, with whom I share only partially something. But I think there's a lot of pseudoscience and pseudo-philosophy out there, and that I hope I've been able to distinguish myself. And it is, but substantially, you can say that it is about science and spirituality in the light of Sri Aurobindo, and which, by the way, if I may also say, I'm going to have a 12-week course, especially precisely on this subject. If people want to register, I can give them the link. And yeah, the subtitle was Bridging Science and Spirituality, Consciousness and Evolution in a Synthesis of Knowledge. So this is also quite heavy reading, but I promise you, if you go through it, you will have I guess, a very, very different understanding and point of view of what science is telling us nowadays, and this synthesis of knowledge and philosophy, idealism, spirituality. That is very different from what you find outside there.
Wonderful, sir. Thank you so much for that. And we would like to know, could you please share about this 12-week program that you're talking about, the details, the links to it? We could, yeah. So.
Yeah, and now I don't have the link now, except I have to look it. I can send it to you later in an email. It is substantially based on the book of Spirit Culture Nature, but I get into also through Zoom sessions, I get into contact with people. There's then also extra material. I have also built some other lectures. It is also a course that might be intensive. It will need people to dedicate their time to it.
What kind of people can join this? If you can, it will help people to.
Everyone interested, provided that they make an effort. It is not just an easy ride. It is about philosophy at a bit higher level than usually. But not only philosophy, it needs your attention. Yeah, because I don't want that people subscribe and then say, "Oh, it's so complex." Because I go also into some experiments of modern, for example, the Libya Experiment. This was a famous American neuroscientist who made experiments about free will. Yeah? So I describe how the experiment worked with the oscilloscope, and it gives also some graphs, and so that people know also from the empirical experimental point of view what we know and what we don't know, what these experiments say and tell us and what they don't tell us, especially what they don't tell us. That's because I think that it is not necessary sorry, it is not necessary to go into this parapsychological realm, or because there are a lot of experiments also about paranormal effects and so, and they're very debated and contested, and then there is no common acceptance on these things. I just take peer-reviewed research articles on accepted journals and take them, only them, and this is more than sufficient to show that a lot of prejudices that we have in our mind are simply wrong. That this physicalist point of view of explaining consciousness doesn't hold at an examination, examining their own scientific papers of the physicalists themselves. So it's a journey, a 12 weeks course, we're of 1 hour, 1 hour and a half of Zoom sessions where people can participate, ask questions. They will get also some homework to do, and a real university course, college course online.
Thanks for your time.
Thank you very much, Daniel. Also to you and your wife. It was a very inspiring, and it allowed me to let out a lot of things that I had in my mind, right? And it was very interesting. Thank you for having me. And
my conversation with Dr. Masi helped me see how science and spirituality can come together to build something bigger than themselves. It will be wonderful to know your thoughts on the interview and if it inspired your worldview in any way. Thanks for being here. I will see you soon with another interesting mind demystifying another interesting topic. Until then, take care.